in education in situations of conflict and emergency. Before I do that, though, I want to perhaps deviate a little from normal practice and thank my colleagues at the beginning, the people behind the scenes who've put this together. I want to thank Sabrina Hervey, Jade McCullough, Nicole Suarez, and Ryan Chittenden, because without them, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you to all of you. I would like to begin by introducing the three panelists who have been very gracious in giving us time today, but also time ahead of this in preparing for this. Dr. Margret Sinclair is an education planner who works now as a consultant, but who has a long and very interesting history of professional experience in this particular area. She started working in this area in the 1980s, working with UNHCR, and then she also worked with UNICEF. Margret was key in setting up the International Agency Network for Education in Emergencies, and she also worked here in education above all for a number of years, establishing its section on protecting education against insecurity and conflict. So she has this long history that she brings to it. More recently, she's worked in her own capacity, working to put together an organization called NISSEM, which really looks at social and emotional learning in educational materials. So honestly, I can't think of a better person to join us on this. We are also joined by Dr. Aqeela Datoo. Aqeela comes to us from the Aga Khan Foundation, where she leads up partnerships with a particular focus on education. She has more than a decade of experience working in this area across the globe, including in Asia and Africa. And she specializes in education design, post-conflict education, and along with the partnership part of her mandate at the Aga Khan Foundation. Of particular interest, in addition to all of this, is her doctoral thesis, which really focused on teacher responses to conflict, particularly ethnic conflict in Kenya. She's also a published author on school leadership and post-conflict societies. I also want to introduce Anfal Saqib, who comes from Education Cannot Wait. She leads their first emergency response window and is also lead on their anticipatory action. She's an international expert with experience in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, again, across the globe, looking increasingly at Africa and Asia. And she's looked at she's also managed large-scale innovation programs, worked with the British Embassy in Lebanon and Syria, and particularly in relation to the long Syria crisis. And she's also worked on the Girls' Education Challenge. So there, I think we bring together a group of people who have both breadth and depth of experience in this topic. I am Mary Pigozzi. I am part of the Education Above All Foundation, where I lead the Educate a Child program. Along with Margret, when I was at UNICEF and she was at UNHCR, I helped initiate the network, the INI network, and I have worked particularly in longer-term experiences in both Haiti and Rwanda in terms of the crises that they have faced. So I thank you all. That's who you have in front of you. We will now look a little bit at how we will work. So I'm going to present questions to the panelists. I will ask them to respond to specific questions. You may wish to ask them a question. If so, please use the function that Nicole explained. And then at the end, there will be a chance for questions, and so you can direct a question either to all of the panelists, to anyone in particular, or to nobody, and then we will pick it up from there. So thank you for that. Let me begin then by focusing first at questions to Anfal, who, again, let me remind you, works in Education Cannot Wait. So I'm going to ask her about what role she sees education playing in these conflict and emergency situations. And then secondly, given that, how does your organization make the case for supporting education in a conflict when there are many and competing urgent needs? So if you wouldn't mind, Anfal, for those two questions in whichever order you wish.
Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting Education Cannot Wait to be part of this important conversation today. Before I carry on, can I just check that you can hear me okay? Excellent. All right, great. So I feel like the topic today is even more important because we're seeing conflict-related crises in particular, and the number of forcibly displaced people, including children, on the rise globally. So in terms of the role that education can play in conflict and emergency situations, I think education can play multiple roles in these settings. And I think it's important to start and reiterate the really obvious point that education is first and foremost a human right. So therefore, it's individual children have that right to education. And if we don't prioritize education, kind of going back up to the macro level, for crisis-affected children, given the scale of crises globally at the moment and the fact that we're in an increasingly more fragile world, we won't be able to address things like the global learning crisis, and we won't be able to advance sufficiently on things like SDG 4 or even SDG 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment. We know there's a whole host of global evidence that says that education can promote peace, social cohesion, economic empowerment, and also contribute to gender equality. So, if we don't prioritize education as part of humanitarian responses, then we miss the chance to advance on those priorities for individual children, but also their communities and whole generations. There's other things that I think education can also be used for. So at a systems level, it can help to make systems more resilient to crises, especially if there's data available, which there increasingly is on, in particular, climate crises, which can be used to help to prepare and anticipate and put in place plans and financing ahead of time. But education can also take on a role, especially in acute emergencies, which is beyond learning. And it can really be a critical lifeline to protect children and keep them safe, to things like child marriage, child labor, recruitment by armed groups, and other forms of exploitation. And it can also be used, and this is a real focus in ECW's programming, to ensure that the most vulnerable children are prioritized. So girls, for example, can be disproportionately affected in crisis settings. So it's important to make sure that education and emergencies responses are safe, inclusive, and gender transformative as far as they can be. And then moving now to what ECW is doing to make that case. So at the global level, a big part of what we do is advocacy. So first of all, highlighting how education is, as important and needs to be up there with other sectors as part of a humanitarian response, and putting a spotlight on crises around the world, in not just the kind of new and emerging crises, but also kind of existing, protracted, long-standing, forgotten crises, and highlighting some of the drivers of those crises, whether that be about climate change, education under attack, and looking at, and really generating at all levels political commitment and support for education and emergencies. The other thing that we do is to try and provide thought leadership, and we do that in multiple ways, so generating knowledge products and learning from some of the work that we do around the world. But also, as part of that kind of putting a spotlight, one of the things that we do on an annual basis, and we just published last week, is our global estimates of children affected by crises. And the report that we published last week showed that that figure has gone up. So it's nearly 250 million children that are crisis affected and lacking access to quality education. And I think over the last 3 years, if you look at that, it's an increase of 35 million children who are out of school and crisis affected. I think the other piece at the global level, which is really important, is obviously about raising funding and looking at how the funds that we have can help to leverage more funding from different partners, but also about looking at the overall architecture. And we have an acceleration facility window that not only helps to strengthen the overall architecture in the education and emergency space, but also make sure that through those partnerships, it's not just Education Cannot Wait that's making the case, but that's a kind of global collective efforts, and also bringing other partners from other areas into the education in emergency space to work on things like anticipatory action and climate and gender issues. And then at the country level, really, it's about the investment of those funds and thinking about program design that applies an intersectional lens to really reach those most marginalized children, thinking about crisis-affected girls, children with disabilities, and then ensuring that education is part of that humanitarian response from the start at the earliest stages of the crisis through our first emergency responses. But alongside that, we also have multi-year funding investments as well, and that can help to give certainty to governments, to partners, over a 3-year period, and also help to move a crisis sometimes from the emergency stage into, more of a protracted response, and help to perhaps give more political commitment and certainty, help to move issues like coordination, like data and evidence along a little bit, also focus on things like refugee inclusion. So that's just a few examples, and I'm happy to elaborate, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think just as a quick follow-up, I would ask you to sort of now dig down to sort of the country level or the local level, which is where the pain is really felt. And what do you see as the key challenges in providing a quality education in those kinds of situations?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think the challenges can be multiple. And again, I think, at the global and the local level, those challenges are slightly different. So I think we know that there's scarce funding, so it isn't possible necessarily to support every crisis, and also having to, that there is competition sometimes between development funding and emergency funding, particularly in some contexts you have, a number of bilateral donors working in more of the development space, but then in parts of the country you have emergency responses as well. So I think trying to look at how you can get more coordination and complementarity between those two sources of funding, so really make those funds that are going to education overall count and make sense. I think going down to kind of response level, and it would be great to hear from the other panelists on this as well, but it can be sometimes about what to prioritize at which stage of a crisis when there's so many needs. And also I think working out, so one of the things, working on anticipatory action, I think there's a little bit of a mindset shift there, where at the moment, I think a lot of the funds are focused on responding once a crisis has happened. But I think shifting some of that into thinking ahead of time, and I think there's a real opportunity there where we know that there's seasonal climate events, to do more of that. And I think that is, potentially something which, if it was kind of more systematically built into plans, that could be quite powerful. I think there is kind of ongoing needs around evidence about, what is effective in terms of improving children's learning and supporting children with different types of needs, and also continuing to build capacity, in terms of partners, and then, we know that some of those kind of teaching and learning pieces can be very challenging to do when you have, large oversubscribed classes, and also trying to get kind of transition from non-formal to formal. So there's a whole host of challenges that come up when, at the kind of delivery side of things, which I'm sure we'll get into more.
Thank you. So that actually, this idea of anticipating or not just waiting until the emergency occurs to actually do something is really important. And I think that I would ask Margret perhaps to reflect a little bit, given some of the work that she has done with several organizations and in several ways, to think about or to share with us why it's important to have organizations dedicated to this particular topic. So both in sort of the response, but also in the preparation for the response. So Margret, any thoughts you have, I think we'd appreciate.
Hi, it's lovely to be here and back with the Qatar team. I spent 8 years in Doha, working with education above all. Well, the first year helping set it up. So it's lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'll just mention a few things from the early days. But it's not at all complete. From my impression in the 1990s, just before we got to the network, and after the Cold War ended, there seemed to be an explosion of civil conflicts, starting with places like former Yugoslavia and Somalia, sort of breaking up, and it just went on and on, Rwanda, Burundi, etc., etc. So in those days, the issue for education was that it was not regarded as a humanitarian response. And so it was extremely difficult to get the funding. Donors had two categories of funding, one for humanitarian response, one for education, one for development. And so where did education fit in there? And I'm sure that's still a problem, but in those days it was a very acute problem. We tried actually to get education categorized as a humanitarian response by the Sphere, which is a group of humanitarian agencies dealing with health and water and shelter and food. And they turned up their nose and said, no, you're too soft for us, and the donors won't like us if we indulge. So I think Mary was probably there in the year 2000 at the Dakar World Education Forum, and there was a session on education in emergencies, and it was felt that this is worth forming a group to coordinate more, first of all, on this issue of bringing support for education in emergencies, and also the practical terms that in those days people would, if there was a new crisis, Mary would go there, somebody from UNESCO would go there, someone from Save the Children would go there, people from all sorts of organizations would go there separately. And so it was a big burden to people in the field, actually, and obviously there is less coherence in the response. So after the Dakar World Education Forum, there was Chris Talbot at UNHCR brought together the big agencies, and we had a 3-day workshop, actually, or conference, which led to the creation of INEE. And so that's been like a massive success in the sense that there are now 22,000 members, 4,000 organizational members, and 190 countries represented in INEE. And it functions as a network, sharing information, practical information on what's happening, sharing technical expertise and establishing standards. And especially important, we always thought, was convincing donors that this is a serious fundable and fund requiring activity. So going on from that, the education cluster was formed in 2007 as part of the system of clusters from OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and they leaned so heavily on the work done by INEE. So that was another function, achievement of INEE. So then I could say that there was a growing awareness of attacks on education, and this became a big issue. A lot of talk initially about the Taliban attacking girls' schools, which by modern standards they did very sort of tactfully. They would burn them down during the night when there was nobody there, because they were against girls' education. And then there were the, bigger things or different things that came to view. For example, Her Highness Sheikh Moza was really upset by the attacks, the damage to education in the Iraq, post the Iraq invasion, and in Gaza on several occasions. And so she became convinced that international humanitarian law should be enforced in support of education and preventing attacks on education. So when I got to Qatar in 2009, the first thing I did was study intensely, the basics of international humanitarian law, because I didn't have a clue. And that led me to think that probably others in education in emergency had no clue about humanitarian law, and that people in the field of international humanitarian law and human rights law probably had no clue about education in emergencies. So in the year 2009, we convened a big meeting at UNESCO of specialists in education in emergencies, human rights law, and international humanitarian law. And from that, as our response to this crisis of attacks on education in Qatar, Education Above All was set up to handle that as one of its functions. And Education Above All was certainly the leading voice in establishing the global coalition to protect education from attack, which had, again, like any steering group of the main education agencies, UN, Save the Children, and in this case, Human Rights Watch hosted GCPEA. So just to mention that by 2015, GCPEA had worked up standards or guidance on one aspect of protecting education from attack, which is avoiding the military use of schools as barracks or as lookout points, etc. In addition to not attacking them, the international law kind of says in a soft way that education facilities should not be used. And that booklet, the guidance on that was launched internationally by Norway and Argentina under the Safe Schools Declaration, which is like a one-page declaration about protecting education. It's called the Safe Schools Declaration, and it has this booklet attached about non-military use of schools. So 121 countries have endorsed this Safe Schools Declaration, which is a lot. And it's pretty obvious that it says, do not attack schools. But for the purposes of today, I would like to read you the one element of the Safe Schools Declaration, because I feel it's a bit neglected. Education this is from the Safe Schools Declaration, education that is conflict sensitive avoids contributing to conflict and pursues a contribution to peace. We will, blah, 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 develop, adopt, and promote conflict-sensitive approaches to education in international humanitarian and development programs and at a national level where relevant. So I'm hoping that even this event today may encourage the 121 countries that have endorsed this declaration to put some thought into conflict-sensitive education, which we'll talk about all through this event. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Margaret. I think, for many of us, just understanding the amount of effort and the energy that has gone into actually focusing on this topic over the years to get us where we are, even though we're not where we want to be, is really important. But I want to just ask one quick question, and I think this in a way allows me to ask Aqeela two questions at once. I think one of the questions that we really need to address. And I would ask each of you maybe to just give like a few seconds on this, and starting with Aqeela. Why do you think that education has become a target in these emergency situations? Now, I know that in Gaza we are also seeing how much health has been a target, but in other countries it is often education. So why? Because I think that actually helps us go into some of the other areas that Margret has just raised, and that I think we can ask Aqeela to respond to in a few minutes. So just to start with each of you, why is education a target? Aqeela?
Thanks, that's a great question. Education is a great target in these situations because it shapes the future of society. It offers the potential for long-term transformation. You disrupt education, you're almost preventing future generations from engaging in the rebuilding process or from developing the skills they need to address the underlying causes of conflict. So disrupting education also, it denies children, the opportunity to learn, to grow, and it traps them in cycles of violence and underdevelopment. So that's a very quick response from my side, and I'll give the space to someone else because there's so much to say about this.
Margret, why do you think it's a target?
Yeah. Factors within education that certain groups get angry with education because it's a privilege of the rich. That was the case in Liberia. Or because the curriculum is like not sufficiently conservative in terms of the Afghans, or the admission of girls into school. In the case of the Afghans, these are education factors. And I knew this question was coming. And external factors, schools are a convenient place to get child soldiers, or as a barracks for government soldiers, or indeed for rebels. And schools are often the largest government building in a village or small town. And therefore, any group that wants to discredit the government and become famous and so on can attack schools as a proxy for attacking the government and gain a reputation in that way. Those are the answers that came to my mind.
I think we've lost her.
And we may have lost Mary. I'm happy to jump in with reflections while Mary rejoins. So I mean, fully support everything that's been said, and I think particularly, schools as that kind of symbol of stability, on multiple factors, in terms of infrastructure and all of those things I said at the start about the sort of investment in future economic empowerment, social and peace building and so on. But I think maybe one additional reflection I have is that regardless of the crisis, whether it's conflict or climate, actually you get that disruption of education either directly, through potentially schools being a target, but also indirectly, where, you often see school education comes to a pause or comes to a standstill because schools get used as shelters, and that automatically disrupts education. So I think there's that kind of twofold effect to consider as well.
So then let's go back then to Aqeela and pick up on this idea of the role of education. And we've talked a lot so far about sort of the positive aspects of education, why we need it, why it's important to put it on the agenda. But you have done quite a bit of research on, and you also had a lot of experience. So I would like to hear from you how you think education might be used or has been used as a tool to stir up conflict, to encourage division, and potentially even war. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think, because I think that then gets us back to that question at the very beginning about the need for a quality education in these kinds of situations and the need for anticipation in terms of where we are going into the education sector.
Sure. So when education systems are manipulated, they can become such a powerful tool for stoking conflict and division. So this can happen in simple ways, like through the curricula, through the teaching materials, the resources. They almost like start to
I think you're
promote this.
muted.
No,
I can
I-
hear Aqeela.
okay. Thanks, Anfal. So as I was saying, so the curricula, the teaching materials, the resources, they can almost start to promote like biases, one-sided narratives that glorify certain groups, demonize others. In conflict zones as well, like education systems, they can be co-opted to serve a certain political or ideological agenda, where students are, in a way, they're taught to hate each other. They're taught to fear each other, distrust each other from, from anyone from a different community, a different background who's, not a part of that, popular identity. And this becomes particularly harmful when the education system starts to exclude or misrepresent cultures, histories, languages of marginalized groups. And by doing this, they sort of entrench these social divisions between people, and you start to look at them versus us all the time. And that's what education can do. For example, in some contexts, education has been used to indoctrinate children to extremist ideologies, or they reinforce sectarian, nationalistic, or ethnic divides. And these kinds of education systems, they not only perpetuate conflict, but they solidify this divide between groups, which makes reconciliation and peace building so much more difficult. I just want to mention these things can happen in such a subtle way. It's how you even talk about a certain group of people. A teacher can say, oh, well, they're just stupid, when they're talking about a certain ethnic group. And it automatically starts to create this narrative in children's mind that, oh, they're stupid, they're not worthy, they're not intelligent, we are. So I feel like education this is how it's used as a tool to constantly stir up these conflict and division, essentially.
Well, thank you so much for that. So then I'm going to sort of now go back to saying, all right, we know this about some education systems, and in some it's less obvious than others, but it's sort of an undercurrent in some of the even the curriculum materials, some of those kinds of things. So I'm wondering now if we could sort of now go talk again with Anfal and ask you to begin to think about how can we help make education systems more peace-focused and more oriented towards building inclusiveness rather than some of the more harmful aspects that can come about due to within the curriculum, within the language, and even within the way the system is managed.
So I can give a couple of examples from ECW's programming. I think one of the things that's really important is some of that work that we do at the very start of our program design to understand, some of those kind of dynamics, and that's where that intersectional analysis is really important to, look at the kind of the children affected by crisis in a very holistic way, both to understand things like the trauma that they faced and how that potentially will affect their ability to learn. So one of the things that we make sure is that we think holistically about learning outcomes to make sure that we're thinking about not just foundational literacy and numeracy, but also things like social and emotional learning, and ensuring that teachers are also trained to know how to provide support through the classroom and the learning environment for students, and also recognizing that teachers themselves will also have been impacted potentially by a crisis. And then I think the other bit, which can maybe be true a little bit more in refugee settings, and I guess I speak a little bit from my experience of working on the Syria crisis, as well as some of the work we do at Education Cannot Wait. But I think making sure that, when a response is happening, ensuring that refugee and host community children are receiving similar types of support, and that's really basic things from, school meals, to thinking about just generally kind of education support, but also some of those that kind of othering that Aqeela spoke about, actually thinking about how that can be addressed through different types of activities and so on. And then I think it's tricky, I think, at a system level, because that is so much more kind of political and will depend on a whole host of dynamics. It's difficult to talk kind of generally about that, and I think that's where it can be where potentially there's openness. I think it's about taking those opportunities to make those shifts, but I think working where you can to ensure that that programs are at least aware and responding where they can to address some of those issues.
Thank you, Margret. Any additional thoughts you have on this question about, how we can improve the education systems and the education offer in terms of the outcomes we really want?
Well, I was just going to mention the issue of scale, because like Anfal was saying, that there are things you can do on a small scale and the things you can do at system level, and you need to distinguish between those, because on the smaller scale, with a devoted NGO dealing with a limited area or some other such configuration, it's possible to do really, really good work and build skills for peace or whatever may be the desirable terminology in that setting, taking note of all the contextual feelings and issues, and make it really work. And I give you the example from the UNHCR peace education program in Kakuma and Dadaab camps in Kenya. I can't forget it was one of the trainers, Kenyan trainers, said that, but it could have been a beneficiary. My life is totally changed by going through this training. So on a small scale, with intensive support and committed support, it's possible to do just about anything. Another example on a small scale, which I've come across recently, is and I was looking at peer mediation in schools, because that was fashionable in the 90s and early 2000s, and it's died away. And so I was asking the Norwegian NISSEM project expert in Serbia. And so they had a project in Serbia and other parts of former Yugoslavia where they did peer mediation training and training of teachers and so on, but on a small scale in areas that were having mixed population. And they did work in consultation with the government, but the government just picked up the general idea, the Ministry of Education. But in those areas where they actually had the schools intensively having teacher training and support and peer mediators and so on, it was very successful. So, of course, donors lost interest when they forgot about the Yugoslav crisis and the Serbian crisis and so on. But it is possible on that basis. But then, if you try to take some of these things to a full scale, national scale, you can be misled into thinking that these intensive activities can be replicated at national level. And I'll give you the example of Nepal, where a very model project was initiated by UNICEF and Save the Children and UNESCO to include peace, human rights, and citizenship in the social studies textbooks all through schooling. And it was 5 years. It was in multi-agency, and it had two government, the government curriculum partner and the government teacher training partner, and they followed all the rules, and they brought in vulnerable groups and marginalized groups. But then they came out with a social studies textbook, which was a mile long and had like 100 intensive activities in it. And the teachers neither could they do it, nor did they have time to do it. So, and there was no money for training teachers. So actually something much more humble would have been beneficial. So yeah, in general, I would say you have to look at the context, and you have to support people based in the area or the country and see what can be done and what can't be done, and be very realistic.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, I think, for bringing us down to the ground in terms of being realistic. Aqeela, any thoughts from you on this? And then we'll go on to some other questions. We have some from the audience that I would like to share, and then, of course, I made some up as well, just as a surprise.
Thanks so much. And the question is how can we use education in a positive way, right?
Right. I think it's, how do you go about it? It's sort of, we know what we want, and the challenge is how to get there.
Right. So I mean, if you look at schools, they are such a connector in communities. It's where, you have the children, you have the parents, teachers, school leaders, community members. I feel like it's one of these places where everyone congregates. And sort of going back to what I said earlier about the us versus them, one of the ways to get people to break out of that they are, foreign and I am me, how that sort of like division is getting community members, parents, teachers together working on something. And so Aga Khan Foundation, for example, we have this thing called Whole School Approach. And all it is about bringing community members, parents, and everyone together to discuss some of the challenges that the school is facing and work towards designing some sort of solution to that. And just by doing that, they start to see each other as their community, and the us becomes the school community, and the them is everything outside of that. So I've actually seen this in countries where there has been ethnic conflict. And if you study, when you look deeper at some of the schools that were able to sort of rebuild themselves quite quickly after the conflict and all the negativity that was there, is where they banded together as a school community and they said, no, we are one. And all these other identities are external to that. It's not about that. And so I really think that these simple ways of bringing everyone together to focus on some of the challenges and saying, okay, how can we all work together, can immediately break the narrative that is out there that is being politicized. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
So here's a very practical question from one of our participants. And it's sort of fundamental question. How does education in emergencies differ from conventional education? So I'm not sure if any one of you wants to take this on right away. Should I ask Anfal if you're willing, or do you want to pass to somebody else? That's okay too. Just very briefly, because the others may have something to add as well.
Sure, yeah, I'm really happy to start us off. So I think there's a few different things, and I think it also depends on the kind of stage of the crisis. So, at the very start of the crisis, and I think education and emergencies, you know, there's some fundamentals that are the same, right? You need those building blocks of, you know, you need a teacher or an instructor, you need, you know, children, you need a safe learning environment. So I think those things all stand, but I think the way some of those things look can be different, and the way that they're set up is obviously at speed. And you know, I think it's about and I think this is where the work of INEE has been really important, to set some of those minimum standards for what is essential in a crisis setting. I think the other piece, and this is both, I think, an advantage and a disadvantage, is that a lot of education and emergencies work can be in the non-formal space. So whether that's accelerated education, you know, and I think, or you know, just general kind of non-formal temporary learning spaces and so on. And I think that, again, can be both an opportunity, because building on what Margret and Aqeela were saying, you can have a little bit more direct control then over the types of materials and, you know, the implementation and the delivery. But I think it is very important to think at the very start of that crisis about the medium term as well. So to plan, you know, for that protracted setting. And I think one of the other things, you know, I guess where that kind of humanitarian development nexus comes together. So things like transition from non-formal to formal education is a really good example for me of, you know, where you can think in the short term about, okay, we need to get something going on a temporary basis, but then you know, where do those children go in, you know, in a year, in 18 months, you know, in 3 years? So thinking and planning, and that requires obviously that kind of medium-term sight in terms of funding, in terms of coordination, and kind of political commitment as well.
Aqeela, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when that question was asked, I was sort of thinking, like, I mean, they are different. Sort of education in emergencies is different than, you know, just a conventional education. But I also feel that in some ways it's not different. I think the focus of education should always still be on what are we doing to build social emotional learning? What are we doing to ensure that children have, you know, the attitudes, the skills, the values, the resilience, whether they are in conflict or getting out of conflict, or dangerously edging towards that because of climate change, for example. So, I mean, you can look at it in different ways, but I do think that education systems should all have a focus on inclusive education. There should be the ways of teaching, the pedagogy, the materials, how it's used and how teachers show up should be about valuing differences, supporting each other, having that social cohesion. And then, yes, in like emergency situations, then there's a lot around trauma-informed education and peace building. Like in Syria, we've had to do a lot around trauma-informed education, and how do we sort of make our teachers and students resilient given everything that they have seen and experienced. So yeah, I guess that would be what I would add to that.
Thank you. That's great. Margret, I'm going to switch to another question, but it really relates, I think, to part of what you have raised. And the question is around, when you talk about small scale and making that change, it's often agencies that do this, and you mentioned this, you know, this is the people on the ground who are able to activate things. And then the large scale is essentially government. And the question is, aren't these two very, very different cultures? And are there ways to actually address, I guess I'm probably using the word incorrectly, but acculturation between the two? Are there ways to actually make that work? And maybe there aren't. So I think that's a question to you.
Well, ideally they should work together. You know, you have a lot of expertise in projects in country, and maybe the curriculum center or the ministry doesn't necessarily benefit from that expertise. So in NISSEM, our little group working on textbooks networking to integrate SDG 4.7 and social and emotional learning into education materials, we feel that when we look for a partner who is interested in this, but also interested in bringing in the curriculum center from the Ministry of Education, for example, so that the things harmonize. I've got so much to say on this that I'm getting stuck and where to say it, but I'll give you the example from Mozambique in the old days. Mine awareness education was given to the refugees in Zimbabwe and Malawi, and then there were nice booklets on mine awareness and trainings. And when there was repatriation, that material was integrated into the textbooks of Mozambique, because there were mines in a lot of places, unfortunately. So I think that in upgrading textbooks to include social and emotional learning and the themes of SDG 4.7, which include culture of peace, gender, respect for diversity, and human rights and sustainable development, and so on. The government isn't going to be able to come up with all the examples which might motivate young people to act on these things that relate to their country. And I think there's a big opportunity for youth organizations or education projects to explore contextualized responses in this area and develop them and share them with the government. Otherwise, you get the whole world is just echoing social and emotional learning sort of jargon from America, and it's of course there are exceptions, but contextualization is vital. And again, I say that you have to start with from where the country is and the people there and how they want to move forward and what they think is important, and encourage. Give them space to do that, because from the example of textbooks, you're told that, well, we want textbooks in 6 months, and so they just copy the old textbooks, slightly updated. If you're going to change the textbooks to integrate these things we're talking about, you've got to have a process, and it can be a government process, it can be an independent process, it can be collaborative, but you don't just get textbook writers suddenly out of thin air writing a totally different kind of textbook, for example, or the new kind of pedagogy which will support it. And I'll stop there. There's so much to say about the overcrowded curriculum and how difficult it is to sort out what is done in different subjects and so on, but I'll leave it as a sort of taster. And if you look on the NISSEM website, NISSEM.org, you can see a whole lot of examples.
Thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate that. I'm going to quickly, in the last few minutes we have, and I'm going to ask both Aqeela and Anfal in that order to think about this and respond if they wish. Climate, huge emergency. How do you think we can integrate that into the work we are doing for education in emergencies? So, Aqeela, do you want to start?
I think climate is going to cause a lot of education emergencies, and probably is already. It creates a strain on resources, weather patterns, and this essentially, when there is a constraint on resources, that's when politics can use that to start to create these divisions of they are coming and stealing our land, or we don't have resources because they have taken it, and all these kind of sort of narratives start to build. So I do think that in terms of when we think about education and emergencies, I think climate needs to be baked into that as a key element. But honestly, for us as at Aga Khan Foundation, climate is starting to become just baked into all of our education programming because it is just relevant across the board. It doesn't have to be an emergency. Right now, it will eventually become an emergency. So I mean, either way for us, climate is important and we need to start looking at it, and it needs to be looked at in a way that doesn't diminish teachers to just, you need to do this and now you have to teach this curriculum, but also really empower them and engage them in that conversation around climate and give them that agency to be like, okay, climate change is an issue. Well, how are you going to integrate this into your lessons? How are you going to talk about it with your students that builds the empathy around it? So yes, I see climate is very natural part of education emergencies, but I would say climate needs to be looked at just writ large anyway in education.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Anfal, how do you see this?
I mean, I think there's the kind of, and like I said, there's the kind of sort of the climate events that we know about and can plan for, and then there's ones that we don't know about. And I think there is definitely also that interplay that Aqeela referenced in terms of scarcity of resources, where climate can then make, exacerbate conflict as well. So I think there's that kind of important interplay there. I think maybe what I'll do is just share a little bit more about what ECW has been doing on anticipatory action, because this is actually a really new area in the education and emergency space. It's been used in a number of other sectors. And what we've done is initiated 2 pilots in 2024 in Pakistan and in Somalia. And the idea is to put in place plans linked to a particular climate hazard to say, if the situation exceeds, whether it's sort of, river levels go above a certain level, then here's a ready-made plan and pre-positioned financing. So that's what will be triggered in the event of X, Y, Z happening. And in Pakistan, it's been really interesting because at the community level, we've made sure that it's the students and the teachers themselves that are helping to define what those anticipatory action plans should be for themselves. And there's other models emerging as well. So I know that IRC is involved in doing some work around parametric insurance in Kenya. But I think ultimately, as Aqeela said, we need to be ensuring that those risks around climate are considered, continuously, and they are part of, all progress. Most of the countries that are fragile will be vulnerable to climate change. Again, it's, one of those emergency settings where girls can be disproportionately affected as well. So I think thinking about how, not just the response, but the work that can be done ahead of time as well, to make kind of individuals, communities, systems more resilient to climate. I'll stop.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we also have to stop there. There's so many, I want to thank all of you for really sharing your time and your expertise and the depth of your experience and your intellectual thinking about how to put all this together. I feel like we've just sort of touched the surface, and there's so many other questions that I wanted to ask, because we talked a lot about girls. I want to also talk about what happens to boys, because they're also a key part of what happens to them, but also what happens to girls. I think it would have been good to talk a little bit about the knowledge products that we're all engaged in and what role they play. So I hope that we have an opportunity to do this again sometime. But again, to the 3 of you and to those of you listening that I can't see, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your commitment. We really appreciate it, and have a good day, whatever's left of it for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.